you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. Having translated the heady work, Astronomical Algorithms, and having converted all of its complex tables of the cycles of the sun, moon and planets into computer code, Dr. Robert Barratt is a research scientist at the Queen's University in Belfast, who designed then built his own software which he uses to produce 3D simulations of Neolithic structures. In this episode, Robert shares his struggles against compounding variables, and he highlights the importance of matching archaeoastronomical assumptions with material culture, and presenting his methods for utilizing statistics, random numbers and comparative models to gauge intentionality within archaeoastronomical alignments. Robert demonstrates how he married big data with field experimentation within the Neolithic temples of Malta and in the timber circles of Ireland. Prepare to journey into the mathematics of archaeoastronomy, learning how computer coding is being applied to separate intentionality from chance with Dr. Robert Barratt.
I was born in Cambridge in the UK, but I'm actually half Italian, so I grew up in the south of Italy. Yeah, which you wouldn't tell. I mean, I imagine your viewers don't have video, so you can't really see my face, but I don't look very Italian, let's just say.
Well, you didn't have to tell the audience that. They're picturing some kind of Fonzarelli type character at the moment.
Is that not what you're seeing? Are we seeing different images?
Yeah, there's a bit of Fonz about you there. You got the collar up and stuff.
Yeah. No, I grew up in a town called Martina Franca in Puglia.
Okay. And when did you come to the UK?
Well, I mean, I said I grew up. I lived 4 years in the UK when I was a child, and then I moved to Italy, and then I came back to the UK when I was 18 because I thought I wanted to do archaeology for university, and the Italian education system isn't quite my style, let's just say. So I preferred coming over here to do it, and I've been here since. Now been, I don't know, 13 years, something like that. Yeah, that makes sense. That's maths.
The first episode in this podcast was with Professor Giulio Magli from the Polytechnic in Milan,
Yeah.
who's a leading archaeoastronomer. Are you aware of Giulio's work, are you?
Yeah, I think he's a very good researcher.
Within the realms of archaeoastronomy, I've discovered that
Mm-hmm.
where a footballer can be defined as good for what he does, an archaeoastronomer is good for what they don't do and what they don't say.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Care to elaborate?
Yes, I would. There's a threshold in these types of studies,
Mm-hmm.
which you know so well, and it is when the researcher gathers data and interprets packets of data, not focused on conclusion.
Okay.
I think that's important because so many are tempted to interpret what was in the minds of the people, and I feel that's a failing.
Mm,
I think you leave that to ethnographers, to cultural scientists, and archaeoastronomers should focus on numbers, digits, and details. And Julio does that.
yes.
And I worked in the Khmer landscapes of Cambodia, and I 2 years ago presented a dynastic meridian which predates Julio's dynastic meridian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a non-academic, but in the most scholarly way. He had the balls to say in our interview,
Mhm.
I really like the line you've presented, but he says, I need more work before I tell you if I agree with it or not. And I thought, that's great.
That is a very good answer, and that's, as I said, why I respect him as a researcher. I think that is entirely correct. I think the role of, I think, just like processual archaeology in general, or just archaeology that deal with data, whatever that data may be. I do think our role is mostly to kind of limit the speculation that others are doing, if that makes sense. I like to, when I get new data sets, or try new methodologies, I like to leave it quite open ended, because I think that it's not really my place to make those conclusions, as you say. And there's definitely people who can, and are very capable, and take the data and do really interesting wide studies of entire cultures. But I don't feel comfortable doing that myself. I like to just go, here's the data, do it as with you as you wish. Hopefully it helps. That's my message.
I live in the high Andes of Colombia myself, and I work with indigenous communities here,
Hmm.
making documentaries about their alignments and their sacred sites and we call them, they're known as wakas, which are
Oh.
natural temples, a bend in a river, a predominant waterfall, an undulating hill. These are wakas, and they were sanctified like temples were in the Western world.
Mm.
They don't talk about cosmology or religion. Andean wisdom is known as cosmovision,
Yeah.
and that has a hugely mythological, ancestral story, oral based element in it.
Mm.
So what I do is, knowing this, when I see people presenting a Google Earth alignment and saying there's an insignificant alignment, I'm like,
Mm.
oh my goodness, it isn't. Even if it's to less than half an arc degree and it connects to two temples, that's the beginning of the significance of the alignment.
Yeah. No, actually, it's an interesting question. Can I ask a bit more? Like,
Yes.
so do they have any kind of, like, when it comes to like structures, for example, is there an indication of their beliefs in that, or in iconography? Is there anything that points to it?
When the conquistadors arrived in Colombia in 1537, wonderfully, four chroniclers interviewed the last of the Muisca shamans about their creation mythology.
Oh.
And we have two main temples, a temple of the sun in the north and a temple of the moon in the south.
Mm.
The northern Muiscas were a solar based religion. Their agriculture was done by the sun. But in
Mm.
the south here, it was a lunar culture who went by the moon calendar and worshipped the moon. The sun was worshipped with gold, the moon with silver. The artifacts that are found around the central lunar temple and at the smaller satellite lunar temples, there's a propensity to show our angles of lunar maximum and lunar minimum on those ceramics.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Whereas 150 kilometers north at this chief temple of the sun, the the solstices seem to be preferred. So there's a definite lunar geometry on the ceramics and a
Mm.
solar geometry. And what's wonderful is we have the cultural mythology that talks of the eclipse, for example, represented the marriage of the sun god, the moon goddess Chia. It's the most sacred day in the calendar. Like I don't need a calendar to tell you what time of the day it is. I can look at the angle of my shovel and get it to within half an hour. For people to use the word calendrical, this is a calendrical temple. It's used for recording. Is it fuck?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely, I think, I remember reading a lot in literature about like how important these days are of passage, and like,
Mm,
winter solstice being, a day from where you go from one season to the next, and it's suddenly turning into the sun being more. And whenever it's been discussed as a practical kind of thing of, oh, now I know when I need to plant my seeds, I always think that that is kind of not giving people in the past enough credit. If you're a farmer, you know when you're planting seeds. You don't need somebody to tell you today is the 12th of July or whatever, to do it. You can, you know when the right time is. And also there's variations in the climate, so One year you may plant them slightly earlier, one year you may plant them slightly later. That's nothing to do with the position of the sun.
There you go.
So if you do have these kind of alignments, and these alignments, we can say with some certainty that, there is some alignments with the sun. I think it is to do more with a belief system than with any kind of practical kind of connotation. I don't think that's really what we're talking about. It's definitely an interest in, what's out there, or I don't know. It really depends on the culture as well, obviously.
Prior to the 12th century, around the 10th century, certainly in southwest North America and as far as Inca, Peru,
Yeah.
while we often talk about cardinality and orientation and alignment, it looks as if perhaps the people here had a almost obsessive drive for straightness as a concept,
Mm,
living in a wild and unpredictable world full of tigers and horrible people,
mm,
to move straight, often north, directly towards that fixed, also stable fixed spot. There seems to have
mm,
been a real focus on straightness to the point where all over the Americas, an alignment will go straight through a landscape for 6 miles and it'll come to a cliff face.
mm.
They did not deviate. They carved steps up that cliff face. They went through rivers, and you can see the remains of bridges and whatnot. So straightness seems to have been so important to them.
Mm. That is interesting.
It is interesting because it's quite a fresh outlook, because you never think about we define material objects as being straight or squint.
Yeah.
But when you think about a group of people progressing through different kinds of environments, really focusing on straightness, I think it's something exceptionally important, and I think it's reflected in today's culture. There's a whole internet group called
Mhm.
Straight Liners, and there's big money prizes, and what they do is go, we walk this straight line, and they have to show their GPS
Yeah.
plots, and there's only so many meters of a deviation, and I think
Yeah.
in every group of people, there's some of us that just like walking in straight lines.
I I must confess, I don't know if you ever watched the YouTube channel GeoWizard, but he's walked on a few straight lines,
Oh, really?
and yeah, he does like straight lines across Wales and straight lines across
Geo Wizard.
various places. Yeah, yeah, it's a good channel to check out.
He's a good guy to talk to because he is physically conquering the same kind of obstacles as our
Yeah, I
forebears.
guess so. I guess so. But I think the reason like, I find also that interesting is an argument which I'm very fond of, which is about confounding variables as well.
Mm,
Because there's a lot of arguments. Like I always feel like the whole alignment issue is sometimes a bit of a circular argument, right? People assume that there's some kind, some site is aligned to some astronomical
mhm,
entity, equinox, solstice, whatever you want.
mhm.
And then they test it out and they find out there is an alignment, and then that proves their original assumption. But it's not taking into account that there's other explanations that could
Yes,
be why they're doing certain things. So what you're saying is, they weren't necessarily, walking a straight line because they were walking towards the sun or something like that.
that's right.
They're doing it for completely other reasons, but coincidentally, that same kind of straight line could be misinterpreted as some kind of astronomical alignment if it happened to hit, something on the horizon, which I think is quite interesting.
They even know where the indigenous school was in the 16th century. There was a set of caves called the Cucas Seminarius, and they taught geometry, geodesy, and magic. That was what the priesthood here were taught. And
Oh, I wish I could do that. I want a course in magic.
oh, imagine this has got Gandalf written all over it. And
Oh, I love it.
why is this road straight? Because the person who built its grandfather built the most famous straight road in the region. So the next generation
Yeah.
would then expand it. That's certainly what happened in Khmer landscapes. There's solid evidence of the dynastic progression of, especially of prime meridians, where
Mm,
a ruler in the 9th century pulled a prime meridian, marked it with two temples.
mm,
And then 2 generations later, you'd see another temple being placed on that alignment, and you would see a tightening of the alignment. And then this moves across the landscape. I think it's possibly that is why we people, researchers struggle so much because if you, let's take this to Malta. Let me ask you a question at the end of this. If you're looking at Malta on an elevation plan and you've got your temples, dare I say, plotted,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then you start deriving alignments, how do you know if you are looking at something that was constructed within a 200-year period, or if you're looking at a 600 years of parts and pieces? How do you create some sort of chronological platform before you interpret Malta, for example?
Well, no, I think in Malta specifically, we do have 600 years sounds about right. Yeah, a
Oh,
lot of time of construction. Some of the temples, some of the earlier temples, stuff like Scorba and Gigantia. I'm trying to think of like the exact dates now because they've changed recently, but I think
mm.
we now think about 3700
Oh,
BC.
really?
I think that's about right. Um, but then you've got more modern temples like Tashin and well, Tashin's probably the most famous, more modern temple, which probably was built, I would say, at very least, I would say 500 years later.
Mhm.
I mean, parts of it are much more older than that, but you do have it is a long time scale. We're not talking of, oh, somebody decided to build temples and then suddenly within 10 years we have like 30
Mhm.
temples. It's something that happened through time and
Mhm.
many generations of people transmitting knowledge from one generation to the next and also improving them because
Mhm. Mhm.
we do have there's a whole discussion about an increasing complexity with the temples in later periods, which is obviously been interpreted as different cultural shifts and
Mhm. Mhm.
possibly different people coming into power. There's lots of ways you can kind of look at it, obviously, um, but it definitely shows transformation. It's not one clean thing that every temple is exactly the same or built in the same way. So there's definitely a big change throughout the times.
I heard you say something last night, and I don't know if I've picked this up wrong. It's a really short question, this.
Oh yeah.
Regarding the book, Astronomical Algorithms,
Okay, yeah.
did you personally take those astronomical formulas and convert them into code?
Yes.
You did that. That was you.
I've done it twice in two different code languages, and let me tell you, it's not fun.
Please, could you explain to me why on earth you thought I'm the guy to do this? And also, who exists that can tell you if you're right or wrong?
I mean, that is kind of a bit of the problem which I have with this, is that like I hope it's all right, but there's always like that part of me, the imposter syndrome, being like, what if I'm wrong? Who's going to tell me?
Yeah.
Um, but like, so I mean, the reason why kind of do you want me to kind of go maybe into how I got into this place?
I
Really, is
need
by
you
the way.
to tell me why you came from an interest in archaeoastronomy to actually creating a tool that could bring it into its next generation of interpretation, is what I'm driving at.
That's it's very kind of you to put in those words, but I think it's probably not as big as you're saying. But I think basically, I was doing a master's in Cambridge in just archaeological thought, I think it's called.
Okay.
What was it called? Archaeological, something about archaeological research, let's call it. And
Yeah.
I was mostly doing 3D modeling, which is kind of my first approach. That's kind of the thing I do the most,
Yeah.
3D reconstructions. But as part of that, I needed to write like a small paper, 8,000 words about it, a piece of research I did. And I thought, I've got these 3D models. What can I actually learn from them? They look cool. They're great, but what are they actually teaching us, right? And I quickly, because I was trying to learn to code at the time, I thought let's use coding as a way to kind of question these models a bit more. So I did a very small kind of study with the temples of Gigantia,
Hmm.
with a bit of custom code that I'd written, but it wasn't as complicated as the astronomical algorithms. I was mostly using just some, I think it was Sproul, I think was the name of the, the article. I can't remember the year, but it was very approximate calculations of sun position, so it wasn't very good at the time. Um, But it got me interested in it because I was curious because when I did this kind of small scale study, although I think now I can probably say that like the data was probably too inaccurate to be correct, but at the time it made me realize that if you've got these, if you got like a winter solstice alignment, for example,
Yeah.
you have like the way it's kind of portrayed in a lot of literature is like it's this miraculous event, this one day a year. You've got this one perfect alignment with this archaeological site, and the odds of this is incredible. And then you look at it and you go, but the full month and a half before and the full month and a half after, you still got an alignment with that site, with the sun, right?
Let me paraphrase that, and you can tell me if I've got this.
Of course, yes.
What you're saying is maybe then that the portal, the visualizing portal on the structures you're talking about, the temples, they're not pointing at 1 degree on the horizon, they're perhaps covering a wider bracket of time.
Yeah, it's entirely how you kind of interpret alignment, right? So a lot of the literature I've seen is, if you got like the sun rising exactly in the middle of your door frame, right? That is incredibly precise.
Maze Howe or Newgrange.
Yeah, yeah, for example. But like a lot of like there's temples in Malta that do it. But the point
Okay.
is like you can get that alignment very, very precise and lovely in the middle of the temple rising. But a lot of the time I find that people are not just content with that. Even if it's like, oh, let's say it's a few degrees off from one another,
Yeah.
do you still consider that alignment? Probably, as you say, there is an accuracy.
Yeah.
People in the past weren't perfect. I'm sure there was some degree of variation. So if you consider that like most temples in Malta have like an entranceway which is probably about, let's say, maybe 10 degrees across,
Yeah.
roughly, we're saying,
Yeah.
if somebody were to consider any point of that an alignment,
Hmm.
right, you've got a 10-degree angle basically,
Hmm.
which because the sun, I mean, I'm going to go technical here.
Please do, because what I'm visualizing is a cone rather than alignment, a cone.
Exactly, that's what it is. Yeah, it's a cone, and the thing is that the sun is moving around in front of you,
Hmm.
and because of the way the declination of the sun works, it goes to plus 21 and minus 21 degrees, right? So that's kind of the angle it works with. It's got a 42-degree angle, right? Which means that if you've got a position and you're looking at that one direction, the sun will always be within those
Yep.
42 degrees from you, right? So if your entrance is already 10 degrees of that, it means that for 1/4 of the sun's positions, it's going to be within your potential alignment window.
Yeah.
No?
Yep.
So if you then put that into months, a fourth of a year is about 3 months, roughly. At the very start of that, the sun's going to be, at the complete edge of the,
North edge.
yeah. So you'll say, that maybe isn't the best of alignment, but some people will still count it as alignment. It depends on, how you look at it. But even so, the middle of that, for a
Yep.
good month, it's still only off by 1 or 2 degrees from
Yeah.
the middle.
Hmm.
So, so at that point, yeah, you can say, oh, look, it's aligned to the winter solstice, but then is it that or is it aligned to the winter sun?
Absolutely. And perhaps neither, Robert. Perhaps it's aligned to a significant part of the year, maybe not in Malta, but certainly in Orkney,
Yeah,
when people and animals start dying, November to February bracket.
yeah,
It could be a block of time, so it's exceptionally accurate to the cosmology behind it.
absolutely. But the thing for me was the realization was that I feel like it's almost a misrepresentation of the data when you see a paper talk about, oh, there's an alignment with the winter solstice. But I mean, I'm not saying that's incorrect. I'm just saying that you are presenting it as like this miraculous thing when really it's not. There's other evidence as well. And it's stuff like, if somebody says it's aligned to the
Uh,
winter solstice, are they saying it's exactly to the middle or are they saying it's, 5 degrees off, right? Because it could be up to 5 degrees off and still have an alignment in theory.
yep, yep,
The, the sun also like is one of those that like people tend to try and get a precise thing. But if you start looking at moon and stars, people are happy with all kinds of alignments, right? You know.
yes.
So the reason kind of when I was doing my PhD and I was kind of looking at trying to find ways to use 3D reconstruction to help archaeology to narrow down interpretation, I thought, right, let's get that study I did and let's try and expand upon it and kind of use it as a test case and see if I can actually, help some of the archaeologists to identify potential areas of interest and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So I thought let's get more accurate measurements. That was the first step because the ones I had didn't take into account precession, they didn't take into account horizon, a lot of elements that can cause inaccuracies. You want to minimize that as possible.
Yes.
And especially because I didn't want to just look at the sun. If you're looking at stars, you definitely need to account for precession. You need to account for proper motion. There's a whole load of additional variables that need to be considered. Um,
All of the variables that had to have been considered by the builders of these temples.
yeah, presumably at least some of them.
For example, when a builder's standing there with his stick,
Yeah.
whether he calls it something or not, he is at an altitude relevant to his horizon. So while whether he's discussing it, he's dealing with it, that he's challenged by the concept.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Yes. So I was trying to use like the best possible data I could get, and that was kind of the idea. Um, and yeah, and that's kind of how I wrote the piece of software called Tarshin Core, which uses these astronomical alignments, which are kind of I did kind of look into it a bit more for my PhD and have tried to modernize them a bit as well because there is a bit more corrections we can do now to those as well. Um, and yeah, and my idea was to there was two things I was kind of aiming to do. The first was to see how precise an alignment could be,
Mm,
basically, how good the data could we get.
yeah.
But also the thing I really was interested in is looking at landscapes as a collection of sites rather than an individual site. Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah. Why Malta?
Hmm.
I think you studied 22 sites on Malta in total. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, 22.
Is that your motivation? Because you could take a complete data set of everything that was done. Was that the reason?
Yeah, it did help. I had already been digging in Malta just for fun,
Okay.
uh, and therefore I knew like I had contacts there as well. But definitely the fact that Malta has always kind of been treated because it's an island. It's a very small island,
Yeah.
um, and it is quite self-contained.
Yeah.
There's a whole debate about treating it as an island as opposed to like a part of a wider trade network. But the point is, you do have, for probably about 30 sites remaining in Malta with
Hmm.
various conditions,
Hmm.
and you don't have any examples of these megalithic temples elsewhere. So it is a very contained data set. And because it's such a small environment, there's a very good chance that the people were talking to one another and sharing ideas, and therefore you can kind of treat it a bit more like a collective.
Hmm.
Although you have to be careful because you end up, with the whole Renfrew chiefdoms ideas, and it's a whole can of worms that we don't have to go into. But
We can if you want. This is what this is all about.
no, it's fine. I taught a class last year on island archaeology,
Mm.
and the general consensus is you shouldn't treat it as an isolated thing, which is kind of what I've done. But also in this case, I don't think it really matters.
But you have to, for research parameters, right? You have to establish a parameter and make an assumption. Now, everything within those parameters is moving at the same time.
Yeah, of course, of course. I think the thing for me, the important thing for me is that one site can be aligned to something coincidentally easily, right? If you've got a site that has one particular rotation
Mhm,
with, say, this 10-degree variation, right? There's so many stars out there, so many
mhm.
sun events, so many moon
Yeah,
events that
yeah.
something's going to be hit, you know? Any site. And actually, I can tell you a story that made me think about this is a few years ago, I was in my kitchen and I got like a load of light shining in my face.
Yeah.
And my house is very long. So it was coming from a window down one end of the house and I was the other end of the house. And I realized it was on the day of the equinox. And I went, my house is aligned to the equinox. It's obviously not intentionally aligned to the equinox.
Mm.
It coincidentally was, right? And that's one site. So my idea is, one site you can kind of you can brush it off as a coincidence. But if, you know, out of 22 sites, and 22 is already quite a small data set, Stephen, but that's what we have.
What's your number? When do you do the Sherlock? Hmm. When does that come? When do you think something becomes intentional is the question.
No, my God, intentional is a whole other kind of worms. So I worked out that we had, well, for Malta, and I think this is probably where we're going with. For Malta, the data I run for 22 sites found that 9 of them were significantly aligned to crooks, to the Southern Cross, right? So that's 9 out of 22. Now, there's some stats I did on this, and it came out at the chances of it aligning with that alignment precise, 9 sites out of 22, um, is, I'm going to try and find it in my paper now, but it's a very low number.
The chances of this outcome are well below the R value of the binomial distribution, roughly 2.558 times 10 to the power of 11%.
Yeah, okay, there we go. That's it.
If 9 of something out of 22
Yeah.
are the same or fall under the same category, you would have a hell of a arguing with me to tell me there wasn't deliberation in that set.
The thing is, you need to put in context. Is the thing, right? So it's a bit more complicated than that because it's not like, if it was flipping a coin, say, right, if it was a 50-50, if you got 9 out of 22 heads, you would say that's not unusual, right? You see what I mean?
But it's not 50-50.
Yeah, it's not 50-50. But so what is it? Is the argument, right?
Uh-huh.
So I worked out that roughly because there's 4 stars in the Southern Cross, so if you were to try and align to any of them, right?
Yeah.
The kind of, and with the kind of standard deviation which I had for my own research, because you have to, my research isn't perfect; it's got some errors in there. So I made like a rough calculation.
Okay.
Plus, I tried to estimate what the error would be in somebody trying to build a temple to align to something,
Mm-hmm.
right? I roughly estimated that you'd basically be able to hit as a Southern Cross in a 20.6 degree radius. Okay. So if you take a 360 view from where you are now, right,
Yeah.
a 20-degree angle from that would be, you would hit the Southern Cross there. Okay. Which is not a lot,
Yep.
but it is obviously like more than 1%, like that, it's not, I'm not saying it has to be absolutely spot on. And then you can do some maths, and it's all about just probabilities. You can just put it in. And basically, if you got like a 20.6 degree angle that you're accepting, and you got 9 out of, I got it wrong, it's 23 sites I was looking at, then that works out at 0.000228% chance that the alignment would happen randomly.
Oh, okay.
So if you have 22, the classic examples, you've got 22 sticks, you drop them on the ground, the chances that 9 of them would be aligned to the crooks is that small number.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole other argument that we need to talk to about, um, you know,
Mm-hmm.
other circumstances that could skew that, because there's a whole other aspect to it. The point is, like, I'm not trying to say with certainty they were aligned to the crooks. I'm just saying that if we were to look at all the constellations and all the stars and all the sun and the moon, the most likely candidate would be the Southern Cross, because that's the one with the highest number of incidents possible. Um, yes.
What you're describing, it falls into alignment more with the irregularities and variables faced by the ancient builders, I think,
Hmm.
rather than projecting our standards onto what they did.
Yeah.
Let's have you comment on that, and then we're going to come back to the crux.
So actually, part of what I did, this was part of my PhD, is I actually did a field experiment to try and see how accurately you could build a temple.
Mm.
Okay, which I thought was the best way to kind of try and capture it. So there's I think it's in Menaja. No, it's Hagaquim, I think. I can't remember. It's been a while since I looked at my own research, but yeah, but there's a site in Malta where in the countryside next to it, like in kind of the area around it, um, they found a posthole basically in this country. Now, the problem with this posthole is that it's undatable. There's no remains in it. You know, it can't be dated to when it was. But they did some studies. I think this is in Tura primarily, and maybe in Agis as well. They're kind of the main people in Malta who do this kind of stuff.
Mm.
And they worked out that by using this pole, you could fairly accurately orient the site to the equinoxes.
Hmm.
So the way you kind of do it is if you put a pole in your landscape, right, and you make sure that you're standing between the pole and the sun and the pole, right? So the sun is in your landscape,
Hmm.
and then in front of it is your pole, and then you kind of walk to where you want your temple. As long as you can see those two things in alignment, you can find a point that would also be aligned to the sun, right?
Hmm.
So if you do that for the entrance of your temple and the back of your temple, you now have a temple which is oriented to the sun.
Yep,
Does that make sense?
it does. Using the shadow of the human body.
You could do it with a shadow, or like I said, it's just kind of, you can just, you stand in the entrance and you look across, you see like here's a pole, the sun's literally behind it. I'm exactly in the right spot. I'm going to put a third pole down. As long as those align, it's a straight line, and therefore there's an alignment. And then you do the same for the back, and therefore then that notation is correct. Now we don't know for certain that they were doing this because there's no written records of it.
They could have. Yeah.
But the point is, for this kind of experiment, you can say it was plausible at the very least, right?
Yeah.
There is evidence, there is definitely a postal in the landscape that does match the equinox, and the site is oriented to the equinox. So therefore, there is a reasonable assumption that this could have happened, because also you only need the pole. That's all you need. You don't need anything more.
And a good rope, well calibrated rope, perhaps.
Yeah, potentially, yeah, but that
Potentially.
it's within the capabilities of anyone, for sure.
Yes.
So if we kind of assume that that's kind of a potential method of them doing it, you can actually try that in real life and see what happens. So I happened to be in an archaeological excavation with some students. So I put some poles in the field, and I went, here's a GPS total station, whatever it's called. Put the entrance of the temple and the back of the temple, right? And I got them to chart those two positions. And I can't remember how many students I had now, but it was like 20 or so. And, based on that data, I could see how accurately that number was, and yeah, if you had like if that number was very much aligned to where the sun was, then that temple could be very, very close alignment. And if it was really off, then it would have been difficult for them to get a precise alignment.
Mhm.
And I calculated, and I think like at one standard deviation, it was like 1 degree off. I used 2 standard deviations just to be sure, so it's about 2.5 degrees off in total. So if you were to use a similar method to make a temple, and students aren't the most precise in the world, and they're kind of doing it by eye, and they're maybe not putting much attention to it. But if you were doing it even a bit lazily, you still could get a temple which was up about 2.5 degrees aligned. Not to say they were interested in that kind of precision necessarily, but that's kind of a baseline. That's the best you could probably do with that methodology,
Mhm.
basically.
Mhm.
So whenever I do any of my results, I take that value into account, because it's kind of as well as the error in my own code and the error in my own methodology. That's an error
Mhm.
you need to account for, because if you don't, then you may be missing significant alignments, or you may be getting alignments that aren't there.
There must be differences between the back wall point and the front door portals.
Mm-hmm. With Malta, I think we got the different case, because with Malta, basically you had the temples, but there wasn't much more that we, at least that we've recovered from outside.
Okay.
So it's not like when we talk about alignments in Malta, specifically the axis of the temple and mostly the main axis.
What I'm trying to ascertain here is, do you see any existence of actual alignments on the landscape connecting a series of 4 or 5 temples? Again, it's dropping sticks on the table. But in an island like Malta, to see 4 or 5 such buildings on an alignment might be indicative.
It sounds very interesting. I wish we had something like that, but unfortunately, with Malta, there isn't. It is very much temple based.
Okay,
Um, as again, there has been landscape studies. Like for example, there's some temples which people have maybe said, "Oh, maybe it's aligned to that island over there."
sure.
There's stuff like that, but there's nothing within the landscapes themselves. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. Just we haven't found any evidence of it within the wider context.
Mhm.
And kind of between sites, I don't think there was much in the way of like intervisibility.
No?
Um, no, you do get clusters of site, but like again, there's nothing in the as far as I am aware, I don't remember reading anything about sites being aligned to one another.
Okay.
But each culture is different, so each culture has different interests. So you know,
Can I ask you why you think 9 of the 23 sites were aligned with the Southern Cross?
so this is an interesting question because I'm not entirely sure it is. That's the thing. I'm not entirely sure they are, right? This is where that ambiguity from the start, because we don't want to do conclusions. Yeah,
Now, you've just joined the cool club because what you're doing there is drawing your threshold line and saying, "Hang on, Ash, this is the conclusions you said were the problem."
absolutely. Well, I mean, I did start off saying that I think my role is mostly to provide the data, not to interpret it. And I think so. The problem for me is all of these additional variables that could impact the results, right? So something I looked at was if you look at wind patterns in Malta. So they may have changed through time, so they're not the most accurate, but it's more a thought experiment than an actual research, this part.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
the idea is if you were orientating your temples downwind, for example, so a very practical reason to do so.
Yep.
Now, suddenly you don't have a range of 360 degrees that you can choose your alignment from. You've got 90 degrees probably, maybe less than that, because that's where your
Mhm,
wind's coming from.
mhm.
So those numbers that I said earlier, the 0.0000%, which sounds so definite, right? That number changes, right? And it starts being like, it starts being 1 or 2 or 3%. I can't remember the exact number, but it starts being significantly less than what you had before. Still statistically significant, but a lot less so.
Yeah, yeah.
So you got these what they call confounding variables that we need to keep take into account because the number I said is based on the assumption that they were intentionally orientating the temples, and that intentional orientation was towards something astronomical. And if that were true, so that's two assumptions, right? It's intentional, it's astronomical. If those two assumptions are true, then it's the cross. So it's the Southern Cross.
Yeah.
But if either of those assumptions is wrong, then that doesn't work anymore. It could be something completely different, and then coincidentally you catch the cross as well. There was a key squared test that Ventura and Argis did in the 80s where they analyzed audio rotation of temples and concluded that it was statistically unlikely that the temples were randomly orientated in those positions. So we can probably say that maybe that intentionality is possible. I'd say, maybe more likely than not. I don't know. Difficult to say, but that's as good as you can get from me. More likely than not. Um, but then the assumption that it's astronomical, that's where I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And that's where it kind of comes down. Because the problem is there isn't a lot of representation of astronomical elements in Maltese culture. So that's kind of what my question was coming with earlier was, can you see direct in the material culture? Because in Malta, you don't really see a lot of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a series of holes at Tarshin which are vaguely orientated toward, like they look like they are in the formation of the Southern Cross, right? But it could also be just 4 random holes that people have put in that look vaguely like it. There's Haga Kim is slightly weird site which has like potential representation of like Pleiades rising patterns. There's some stuff there that may indicate that it could be something, but we don't walk into a temple and suddenly we're confronted with a load of constellations drawn on the wall, or like a clear depiction of a sun, or there's nothing like that. So it kind of makes you think, why they actually interested in it? Like, was it part of their main cosmology? It's
Yeah,
it's it's
yeah.
difficult, isn't it?
Very recently, a paper was published about a specific area about 80 miles north of here known as Vija de Leyva. And there's lots of alignments of standing stones and lots of temples that were perceived as being astronomically aligned. But researchers come along and shown that they point to water sources on the mountains.
But that's what I mean. That's the confounding evidence.
I'm so glad to hear you not making the assumption that these just must have been meridianally aligned to the Southern Cross. Because if you make that call at your level and say this was deliberation,
Yeah,
you're then going to spark a trilogy of people who are then going to take that as fact
of
and
course.
build and draw cultural assumptions from that focus on South.
Yeah, of course. There's a famous paper by Schaefer.
Oh, I.
Um, Let me see if I can find the thing while I talk. But he talks about how you confirm if an alignment is intentional, which I think is kind of the main thing. And the way he kind of presents it is there's three things you have to look out for, right? So the first one is the precision of the alignments. So I think my data and other research elsewhere shows that the alignments are fairly precise, with the Southern Cross. So number one, tick, right? Number I'll skip to number three because it's a bit more relevant. Number three is you have to have written sources,
Okay.
which we don't have in Malta, and sometimes it's tricky to find. So they do say that sometimes you can't do it and it's still fine, but in Malta, obviously, that doesn't apply because we don't have any written sources. But the key point is number two, I think, which is you need to have some evidence in, iconography or material culture,
Yes.
anything that shows that they had an interest in it. And the truth is, with Malta, I don't think you do. I think you do have some things that could be interpreted that way. You know, there's various artifacts that have the drawings on them that you could say that is astronomical.
What you mean? Things like lozenge shapes and things with angular structure.
Yeah, there's stuff like that. There's a famous stone which has like it's divided in like not quadrants. It's less than that. It's probably like what's a quarter and a quadrant. Anyway,
An octant?
I guess yeah. So it's an octant with stars in it, which kind of looks a bit like some kind of constellation.
Okay.
So that good evidence, good. But and you got these marks in Hagakim that seem to be to do with the Pleiades. You've got a few discs that could be solar discs, and that's it. Out of a very vast material culture. So the point is, like, I'm not saying it didn't happen
Mm-hmm.
because it could have. What I'm saying is that, like, saying that oh, the Maltese were obsessed with the Southern Cross. If they had an interest in it, it probably was a tangential thing, where it was a secondary thing. I would argue.
Yeah.
Um, at least that's the way I see the kind of evidence. Unless we discover a new site and there's like a whole hoard of pieces of pottery with like beautiful depictions
Yes.
or something like that, I think would be good. But for now, it's a bit up in the air.
Wouldn't that make the culture different from many others? Because there seems to be a theme of aligning with significant, not just celestial occurrences, but with ponds, with wells,
Hmm.
with streams, with waterfalls. But in Malta, you don't have so many waterfalls and streams and barns, do you?
No, no, that's the thing. I can't think of a confounding variable that would kind of solve this completely. If I could, I would publish it, and that'd be great for me. But I don't know if it exists.
Yeah.
The problem is there's many reasons why somebody could align a temple in a certain way. Astronomical, one definitely. Water sources, definitely. I said wind may have played a factor, but you could have been pointing it to domestic settlements, which we don't really find many of which in Malta.
Yeah.
Or it could be pointing towards, specific trees. I don't know. There's a lots of ways people interpret the landscape, interpret what's around them,
Hmm.
some of which is lost to us because, it's not there anymore.
Hmm.
Some of which we may not even be able to understand because it's so culturally different from us. So yeah, so all I can say is that, with the data that I'm trying to show, with the study I'm trying to do, is that if you take the assumption that it was astronomical and the assumption it was intentional, that's what it was aligned to. That's all I can say. And then it's up to other people to go and try and find proof that it was aligned, to the crooks, or disprove it, or whatever. But that's what the data says. And yeah.
Have the human remains of Malta been assessed in context with alignments and orientations?
So Malta has a very interesting way of dealing with the dead. They use what they call what we call hypogea, which are like underground cave structures. Or there's one which was mostly cave, and there's one which is mostly carved, basically, out of rock. And it seems like the individuals were brought down here and buried, and mixed as a kind of. There's a whole argument about ancestral pools,
Okay, yeah.
people being mixed together. Obviously, depends. There's various interpretation about obviously the burial practices. However, what we know for certain is that there's at least two very big cemeteries like this. One was excavated, unfortunately, in the early 1920s, was it? Maybe earlier than that, even. We don't have a lot of records of that. But it's estimated to have about 8,000 individuals.
8,000.
I know a lot. The other one was excavated more recently, and there was one excavated more recently, but I don't think it was completely excavated, and that also contained, I can't remember the numbers, but a significant amount of individuals. But neither of them seem to be in any way related to the orientations. Especially the one I kind of know more is the Shara Broktov Circle in Gozo, which is close to Gigantia. So it's definitely like related to the site, but Gigantia is pointing completely the wrong direction for it.
Okay.
And the other one, which is the House Eflieni, which is near to Ashin, they are close to one another, but I don't think there's any similarity with the alignments. Um, Again, I don't know off the top of my head with that one, but I don't think anyone's ever mentioned it, and I think somebody would have mentioned it by now if there was something there.
Hmm.
And that's all we know. There's like another small one, which is, I think, fairly independent, called Santa Lucia, and then I don't think there's any more. But at the same time, there could have been individual burials that we haven't found. It's a long time ago, and Malta's landscape is quite ephemeral, so it's not always all well preserved. We're missing a lot of domestic spaces, so there's a lot of stuff that could have been there that's not there anymore. So that doesn't really help us narrow down what these alignments are for, if they are there.
I think you stated the date 3700 BC, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. It used to be 3,600. I think recent carbon dating has pushed it back a bit, so maybe 3,800, but it's roughly that period.
So that's about around 600 or 800 years prior to the first buildings in Orkney in the north of Scotland.
Yeah.
And on a purely aesthetic level, when I look at the standing stones and the structures on Malta, I see what I see in Orkney. Has there been any evidence of the passing of ideas or artifacts or concepts between the Neolithic cultures of both regions?
Mm. Wow, this is a very interesting rabbit hole. No, no, it's true. The Maltese culture, as I said, historically has always been treated as quite an isolated culture. It's always been in the archaeological kind of literature. It's always been seen as very closed off, not really communicating with its neighbors so much.
Yeah, yeah.
And in a way, I think that is partly true. As in, There isn't evidence of like widespread communication and exchange of ideas. We don't have a lot of evidence of like shipbuilding that would be necessary. But definitely, especially in recent times, there has been kind of a reevaluation, and there's artifacts that definitely have made it to Malta. There's a lot of obsidian from like Lipari and other areas in Sicily, as well as stuff like some of the tombs have ochre in it, red ochre, and that comes from Sicily as well.
Sure.
So there's definitely some movement of people and ideas and this kind of stuff. There's As far as ideas go, the Maltese temples have been associated with stuff like the Toloi in Greece, have been mentioned.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
And I think Sardinia has nuraghi, which are also kind of spirally structures. Um, but I think they may be a bit more recent, so I'm not entirely sure the connection between the two. As I said, I'm primarily coming from a computer background, so like the archaeology I know a lot of, but occasionally stuff details are missing. But yeah, but I think Orkney is probably a bit too far. I would say to go directly from Malta, if that makes sense. But I don't know if the idea is, I was recently teaching a class in Neolithic Europe, and I think definitely there was movement of people and movement of ideas. So I think it is possible that this megalithic culture kind of, moved throughout Europe.
Hmm.
But I think it'd be difficult to prove that the idea moved specifically from Malta to Orkney.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something that is interesting on that note is kind of slightly unrelated, but I think it is a good point.
Uh-huh.
You talk about people moving around Europe with this idea. Something that we have kind of looked at um, is the idea. There's always been like this argument in Malta about chiefdoms versus a one big unified society. I think is probably a way to look at. Renfrew always saw it as kind of like his seminal works in the 70s. He always said that Malta was an example of different groups of people separated and like at war with another, or at the very least, like culturally diverse from one another, each building their own temple to assert their dominance, kind of thing. Maybe misrepresenting slightly, but that's kind of the gist of it. And I think what we can see is that because all these temples do share similar alignments and similar building techniques, and if you really look into it, there's a lot of quite innovative ideas. They've got ideas stuff like vertical arcs and stuff like this, which are quite innovative architectural features. It definitely shows there is some commonality throughout the island, which is quite interesting. Shows an exchange of ideas within the island of Malta, at the very least. Which maybe you don't get in other places. This kind of unified culture, especially at this time. These people that definitely trade and talk and exchange facts.
Then that's kind of nods towards the very human idea that there was intertribal island warfare on the go, but yet they were sharing concepts. It's
I know, but it's a very 70s way of looking at archaeology. I know, but it's a very 70s way of looking at archaeology, of looking at the past at like, here's a group of tribal people all at war with one another,
yeah,
and like I'm sure war definitely did happen in the past. Like I'm not saying it didn't, of course, but not all cultures had to go to war. You could Malta, although by the end of kind of Neolithic you are struggling with resources, but there's not that much competitiveness between people. They're more likely to be working together, and at the very least ignoring one another. That's like a minimum.
it happens here traditionally in the Andes. The Musos who controlled the emerald mines and the Muiscas who controlled central Colombia, the gold essentially, they warred constantly, but everything stopped for the harvest weeks, and I think that's perhaps something that we forget about history, as you just suggested, is that there's war was different then as well. Why one would raise a weapon, it was very often a ritualistic act, and it wasn't an economic based
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. And like talking about alignments, if in Malta if we say that they're aligned, because as I said, they seem to be aligned to something, not necessarily astronomical, but they seem to be aligned.
Aye.
Um, and you want to make your temple aligned, and you see that your neighbors will have your temple aligned, but you don't know how they did it. You probably go up to them and say, "Hey, how did you do this? Like, can you teach us?" So I think the fact that these temples exist and the fact that they do have similar orientations shows that there is a lot of cooperation within this society, and there's definitely people who are specializing in certain jobs, and it shows that these people maybe are moving around the island, sharing ideas with everyone.
Yeah.
I think it gives us a nice picture of that kind of society. But it also kind of, I hope it kind of moves away from the way sometimes I've read like a lot of like papers from the Times of Malta, which is like the local newspaper. There's one headline that always got me, which is like sun worshippers on Malta, and I think there's a few like headlines like that, and it's like, no, that's probably not what's happening. It was much more sophisticated than like this ancient tribal person looking up at the sun or something like that.
Sun worship, not Jesus worship.
Yeah, but it's also, I think it kind of carries that connotation, the way we use it, not because obviously there are people who are interested in the sun,
Hmm.
and absolutely, that's absolutely great. But the way we see it is like, they think of, the sun as a god because they're ignorant. That's kind of how we see it, I think, as that colonial mindset.
Yes, that's
And
right.
it's kind of detracting from a community which is probably very diverse. And narrowing down like the Maltese culture, which is so complex and interesting, and the way they see it dead is really fascinating. But to then kind of narrow it down to, oh yeah, they really was interested in the sun, and it was all about the sun. And it's like, oh, but there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more than that.
Yeah. If you had two lists of words and one list contained pre-Christian, pre-colonial, pre-conquest, the word sun worship goes in the other list with heathen,
Yeah,
barbarian,
yeah,
pagan. It does. It has a negative connotation. Can I ask a question I've been desperate to get to?
of course.
Can you tell me how you took your research methodologies from Malta and applied it to the wood henges of Ireland?
Okay.
What a segue.
Oh, absolutely. I love it. Yeah, I mean, so again, I think it comes down to this. Like, as I said, I think primarily I see myself as a digital archaeologist.
Ah,
That's kind of the concept of it. The main focus I always had is on digital stuff, and especially coding. I think is something that can really, really, really change the way we do archaeology. So, although I have studied Malta for my master's, for my PhD, and I have an interest in Malta, um, I'm more focused on creating tools and concepts that can help the wider archaeological community, not just those specific fields. So, with this study that I've done, obviously with alignments in Malta, I have this piece of software, and I was interested to try it in a different data set to see if what results you would get. You want to expand your research and see if it works elsewhere as well. So because I was also at the same time working on doing some 3D models for this project about Ballinahati,
oh,
which
yes.
is a site in Northern Ireland. Um,
The Druids Circle, am I right?
yeah, well, kind of. There's the Giant's Ring next to it, which is known as the
That's it.
yeah, and then Ballinahati is kind of a site just off it, which is I know less about Irish timber sales because obviously this is more recent research, but the interpretation of Ballinahati is that it was some kind of place to display the dead, and you had a platform in the middle where you'd put cadavers on top. But the point is, by doing
Stop.
yes,
I need to take a lay by. I remember where you were going. I need to ask you about that. Did you just say that they were open topped?
yes, this is definitely wood henges. I mean, I'd say yes. I mean, the interpretation we have at the moment is a yes.
Have you found any evidence of what a Buddhist or a Hindu would call a sky burial?
Oh, Skybearer is a term we have been working with a lot, and the site supervisor, who was the primary person for the interpretation side of it, I still hear the words in my ear where he kept going, "More birds, more bodies," is what he kept saying, because I think birds are quite an important part of that ritual, isn't it? Is that yeah,
It's
you put a body in display, to the open air, to the elements, and birds come and feast upon it, and it's part of that.
The bird becomes the catalyst between here and the next part.
Yes, yes. So we made sure to put plenty of birds in the reconstruction just so that people could see it.
That's great. Good. I'm glad I interrupted there because as soon as you said it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is like a sky burial. So
It is.
please find your track again. Let's get
Yes,
right on
sorry.
there.
So as part of that, there was I mean, because they knew I'd done some work on alignments before, they wanted to see what the alignments of Ballinahati were. And my argument was, if we just did a Ballinahati, you'll get a result. It will mean nothing because one site means nothing, right? You want to have a collection of sites and putting in context. Okay, so we found a list of orientations from various sites in Ireland and Northern Ireland, which were taken from various excavation reports, and we used that to calculate if there were any alignments.
Could you put me in a time frame here? You're not talking about standing stone circles. You're talking about timber henges. When were they built?
Oh, good question.
Was it
Yes,
Neolithic?
yes, it is Neolithic. Yes, yeah. As I said, this was mostly done within a group of people working on the same project. So I was mostly doing the technical side; they were doing the more interpretive side.
Uh-huh.
So I just got the data. I mostly interpreted the data. So my understanding of them is a bit more limited than Malta. Just to clarify.
Yeah, great.
It's happened sometimes if you're doing technical work that you don't always get the whole picture. So yeah, so part of this was also an excuse for me to kind of revamp the software as well,
Right, yeah.
because up to this point, do you want me to go technical? I can go very technical on this stuff.
Please do. The people who are listening to this love technical, and I don't like the people dumbing things down ever.
All right, I think I need to kind of give an overview of what the software actually does, maybe.
Please, please.
So the original version of Tarshin, which is what I use for the Maltese temples, was written in C# in Unity. And the idea is it takes 3D models of sites, which are kind of simplified versions of the site. And it used something called ray tracing to raycasting, so to identify if there's an alignment. So what it does, what the software actually physically does, is it puts the temple in the middle of the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then it will calculate the position of the astronomical body, right, in relation to that temple. Okay. So
So the researcher must focus on putting the geodetic coordinates of the temple rather than what's going on around it.
yeah, so you can add stuff like horizon, for example, to kind of add that in to make sure, because that's obviously very important.
Sure.
Um, but the idea is that, yeah, so then the software using the astronomical algorithms calculations will calculate the position of the astronomical bodies in the landscape and then cast a ray, as it's called, from the body to the back of the temple. And if that ray doesn't hit anything, there's an alignment. If it hits a wall or a roof or something, then obviously it's not intervisible, is what we're trying to say, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's what it does. The main advantage of the software I wrote in relation to Stellarium and other softwares that already exist is that because of the way it works, you can run a lot of calculations very quickly. So you don't just go, right, give me, 1 o'clock on the 12th of February this year, what's the alignment depth? It doesn't do that. It can, but it doesn't only do that.
Mm-hmm.
What it does is you say, right, 3600 BC, right?
Yep.
For the sun, give me the alignment every minute of that year,
Oh.
right? And tell me if there's an alignment every minute of that year, okay? So it will go through it and it will produce a big table where if there is an alignment, it will tell you, in this minute, there is an alignment with the sun, okay?
Okay.
So yeah, so you just select which cosmological body you want. You say it does. I think the original version did the was it the 10 brightest stars? I can't remember now. There was something about it. There was something about 10 brightest stars at some point. So it doesn't do all the stars because I think realistically, unless you have reason to believe it was aligned to like a very very minor star. But anyway, point is, 10 stars, sun and moon. So it calculates it for every minute and then outputs this data. But you can also just say, give me the data for 3600 BC, 3300 BC, 3000 BC, 2700 BC, or whatever intervals you want, right? So suddenly you don't have a picture of what's the alignment on the winter solstice in 3600.
Yes.
You now have a very complete picture of the position of sun, star, and moon in a year and throughout the history of a site, right?
Instead of details pertaining to one alignment, you've got like a dome of data.
Yeah, it ends up with like a lot of files, let's just say, a lot of lines of text and of numbers that you then need to kind of refocus. So that's what it does basically, and then you can use that to kind of, if you know what your standard deviation is and whatever as you're dealing with, you can then go, okay, this alignment is within the error margin that we've considered, and therefore there's an alignment at this
Mhm.
point, and you can work out how accurate that alignment is. I put it in a nice, lovely table which only shows like 1,000th of all the data that's in there, basically, that goes into it.
Yeah.
So this is what the first version did. Now, the second version, like even after doing the first version, I felt that it could be improved. Because the problem is, there's a few issues that I found. The first one was that if you use a gaming engine, which is Unity, to do it, and you use 3D models, you have to consider some physical restraints, physical limitations that are going to cause an issue. So one thing I was doing was, so if you got position of a star in the landscape right far away, and you need to physically place it within your world, which is what you're doing with the
Yep.
software.
Yep. Yep.
The distance you can put it is limited by the software, right? So you can put it, 10,000 units away from the thing, but you can't put it realistically where it actually physically is, because the software can't do that. It just doesn't work that way.
I get it. There is a restriction to our XYZ coordinates as far as processing power goes.
Yeah, and it's a gaming software that uses physics, so it's trying to calculate the physics of it, and it just can't at that distance. So you have to, because you're talking spherical coordinates, you can't cut that number down, because really if you cut down the radius, it shouldn't do much of a difference, right? But there is a bit of an error there, basically. So I did notice that like some of the values were drifting away a bit because of this. So I was like, hey, I need to
Yeah.
fix that somehow, and I can't do it within this software. And then the other problem was just generally, I think, although I love 3D reconstruction, I think realistically, a mathematical model, so a model just based on maths without any physical models part of it, is significantly more robust than a 3D model. Just the way simulations kind of work, 3D models, there's a lot of variables that could go wrong. There's a lot of stuff that isn't quite as precise. But if you got like the pure math,
I suppose to get angles to fit and whatnot, it must make design assumptions, does it?
yeah, and stuff like like Unity is fantastic, but there is some black box components to it. So I wasn't entirely sure. Is this doing absolutely what I'm telling it to do, or is it kind of rounding every now and then to places I don't want it to round?
Uh-huh.
So there's a few issues with it, basically, which shouldn't invalidate the original data, but definitely could be improved upon. So what I've done is rewritten it in R,
Okay.
which is a better kind of language for it overall. But also it removed kind of the visual part of it. So like with the 3D model, I could, put it in and then actually look at the model and see how the stars related to it and that kind of stuff.
But let's be honest, you're not doing this for a History Channel documentary, are you?
No, not really. So it's a lot more just pure numbers, basically, which is more intimidating for a lot of people. But at the end of the day, it is more precise, and that's kind of what we're going for.
Yeah.
So yes, I used this opportunity with the Bellinahati and the henges around Bellinahati, which to kind so I used this opportunity to kind of rewrite the whole thing from the ground up.
Okay.
So I've added in the sun and the 10 brightest stars. I haven't added the moon because the moon's quite complicated and I didn't really have time to add it. It was quite a small project.
Mm.
If I do get some funding for it, I will definitely add it in.
The amount of professors and doctors I talked to who could fill up 2 hours talking about the sun cycle,
Yeah.
but when I make reference to the moon, The blood drains from the face.
Right.
Because it's actually a very difficult concept to visualize the moon cycle. Never mind compute it.
Right. I'll get a book a second. Give me a minute.
Aye, okay. What have you got?
With the sun and the stars, there's some stuff you need to consider. So with the sun,
Yeah.
what's happening is you have with the sun, there's various variables you need to consider. So the sun hasn't changed much in the last 5,000 years. It's off by a few degrees, basically, and that's only due to precession, right?
Mm.
So once you've added in precession, you correct for precession. I mean, I've corrected for stuff like atmospheric refraction, the eccentricity, and the eccentricity I think is part of precession. But the point is, once you've done those corrections, the Earth is the sun is pretty easy to map, right? The stars, there's two things. So precession is part of the stars as well, so that has a much bigger impact on them.
Yep.
And then you've got proper motion. So stars are also moving themselves, so you need to calculate for proper motion. Those are two things you need to look in for them,
Yep.
and that's kind of it. Now for the moon, the problem is it's quite small. So the moon is pulled in all kinds of directions. So for the moon, you calculate its position, and then you need to adjust for a number of terms. And I mean, I can show you, but like it's not going to look good, obviously, in audio. But there's basically enormous graphs that just go on and on and on of corrections you need to do to the moon, right?
Yeah. So you're showing me pages upon pages of graphs and charts, physically illustrating my suggestion that the moon cycle is so difficult to, I mean, to conceive. Even seeing it on the landscape, you watch where it is one night and you think, I know this, it's going to be there tomorrow night. The damn thing's in another part of the sky.
I I think that a lot of the orientation people find with the moon must be coincidental. I'm sure people were interested in the moon. That must happen, I'm sure. But the moon cycle is 18 years, right?
Uh,
It's 18 years to get from one extreme to the other. So the chances that somebody sat there and mapped the position of the moon for 18 years, you really have to be into the moon to do that. So the point is, it is important to have it in the software. I am going to add it eventually, but I don't think realistically that these people were interested in the moon. I doubt it. But
really? Really?
I think they're interested in the moon, but I don't think they're interested enough to orient sites towards it. Okay, that's probably the way to put it.
Uh-huh.
I'm certain people were interested in the moon. I'm certain people were interested in all the cosmological.
Okay.
In Malta, I'm sure people were 100% interested in the stars.
Uh-huh. But aligning to it being another thing altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but lining is a completely different thing. So anyway, point is, I didn't have the time because it was a 2 month project, or I think it was a month project, in fact, in which I had to recode the entire thing. So I didn't have time to put the moon in. But we did get some results from this new software with the hinges,
Mhm.
and it's interesting, but it is kind of less definitive, if you want to say definitive, for the Malta stuff, because there is
Mhm.
several stars that have some kind of alignment with the sites that we looked at.
Mhm.
I mean, Sirius has some alignments with them. Rigo has some signs of it. I think Antares.
Some of them are aligned to Sirius, whereas the next one might be solar. Is
Yeah,
that what you're suggesting?
I'm saying yeah. So these timber circles, like, it kind of. I mean, you get a lot of like incidences with a few stars, basically, because at the end of the day, like, if you look at the star, there's a lot of stars which are quite close together,
Yeah.
or will follow similar paths in the sky. So it is quite likely you hit the same kind of star. If if your temple is hitting, Antares and Aldebaran at the same time one year, chances are I'll keep doing that for the next 600 years.
Yeah.
So it's quite easy to kind of get more than one. So I think eventually I concluded that Antares was probably one of the most likely candidates, just because of the number of sites that were aligned to it. I think we had, wait, let me just count, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 sites that seem to have alignments.
When you say aligned to Sirius or Antares,
Yeah.
was it aligned to these stars at a certain time?
Yeah, so that's another point. So there's a question about rising as well, rising stars and stuff like that. So I've not really I'm not focused so much on when a star is rising. I most primarily look at kind of the overall shape it does within a frame. So I mainly look at kind of where it appears,
Hmm.
yeah, where it appears in kind of that frame. So when I presented my data, I usually present the start alignment, end alignment, and then the average alignment.
Okay.
So the start alignment is the first moment we see this alignment occur. Where is this alignment happening?
Hmm.
And most of the time is from the side of the entrance, right? If you got like a value which is like 0, 1 or something like that, it means it's very central. But most of my alignments tend to be, close to 5 or -5 degrees because that's the range of the entranceway. And most of the alignments I find end at +5 or -5 degrees the other side, right? Because basically what they're doing is they're transitioning across the door frame and then disappearing on the other side.
Hmm.
Um, and then the average of that tends to be the right in the middle of the two, and therefore you can kind of see that kind of center point.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously, there's other people who kind of prefer doing it from the center, which obviously makes more sense. It's the rising star, the rising sun. But my data will also show that. So if you got an alignment which is put down as 0 or 1 or 2, that means it's very close to the center. But most of the time, these alignments tend to appear later on, and there's a whole discussion about that. Do you then say, you know, that they weren't interested, that it's not actually an alignment? Again, the data kind of shows numbers. That's what it does. It gives you the picture. It says
Hmm. Hmm.
if you're going to speculate about orientations and alignments within the frame of these sites, you can. These are the limitations that you've got. And then it's up to how the researcher defines an alignment. It's up to how a researcher sees that they then can do certain conclusions. If you're
Hmm.
quite wide with your description of what an alignment is and you say anything that goes through the door frame at any point, then Antares, that's the one you're looking for.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be precise and say it's the exact middle, the center, I'm going to tell you there probably isn't something that is consistent throughout. There's nothing that kind of stands out as being, a pattern of alignments, and that's kind of how we do it. I don't think there's better ways of kind of showing that data necessarily without kind of closing down some avenues of research.
So your interest in Ireland, it was almost a way to test your own ways of approaching the subject.
Yeah, I think so. As I said, like for me, the main thing is the tools I'm making
Hmm.
rather than the data sets I'm using. Like, if I were doing this study on, Incan temples or some other thing, I would still be happy. I don't mind.
Hmm.
Malta has served me very well because it is a very, as we discussed earlier, it's a very good data set for this kind of conversations. Um, but at the end of the day, for me, it's here's a tool that people could use to do it. Um,
Yes.
and my aim with this is like the tools are written and they are publicly available. Yes, they are publicly available.
What is the name of this tool and can it be accessed? Does it cost? Is it public?
It's a good question. So, by the time this podcast is out, I'll make sure there's a Git a Git account for it. The original Tash, it's called Tarshin Core from Tarshin, which is one of the temples in Malta. Um, Tarshin Core, the first one is on GitHub still, but as I said, it is probably a bit more limited. So the new one should be easier to implement and more accurate.
Hmm.
Now that being said, it's not easy to use because I've not yet found funds to spend some time writing a documentation and or even an interface. It's very code based at the moment. Um, but what you should be able to do with it, with a bit of knowledge of coding, is you basically input a CSV file, comma separated file, which has um, I think it's just like site name, Eastings, Northings, site orientation, and then a few other things about what the entrance looks like, what's the maximum you would accept, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And then what years you want to analyze, and that's all you do. You basically have to write a line that says, Darshan core in brackets, the name of that thing, and then it should just run it. And then you have to then kind of you get a load of data that you then need to interpret. It's not very accessible at the moment. I realize that. Unfortunately, as I said, I have not been in a position where I could spend a lot of time doing it. But it is free. It is definitely something I want people to be able to use. It's something that I hope that will catch on, and I hope eventually I'll have a bit of money to put a few months aside to write up something to make it a lot more accessible.
I would suggest you write a pitch letter to an app developer and say, "Look what I've got. It could be worth £49 a download."
Uh, I know, but I think I do believe science should be completely free and devoid of commercial kind of aspects to
Yeah.
it. But it is true. It didn't. I don't know.
I wonder if your university masters would agree with that, because they'll probably have a something to say about who paid for the thing if they're paying for your time, I suppose.
It's true. It's true. That's very true as well. But I don't know. I think
It's a complication.
it is a complication. It is a complication. But I'm a strong believer that especially code, but just any kind of information and data that you use should be accessible and open.
Yeah.
And actually, you asked a question earlier that I actually forgot to answer, which was, how do I know that, like, who can check my stuff and who knows is correct?
That was the very first question.
Yeah, and what I hope is that people listening in will go and check my code out and make sure it's fine, uh, because the truth is, a lot of code that you see, a lot of software you see nowadays in archaeology and in general in research is not really peer reviewed. I put it in publications. I made sure that it's publicly available. But the people who have an expertise and capable of kind of looking through and making sure it is right is very limited, right?
Mm.
And and it is a problem, I think, because all of this research I'm doing, I'm working on the assumption that my code is correct, and I've done plenty of testing to try and ensure that it is as good as possible, but it's not been independently verified. And I hope somebody, the best case scenario is somebody looks at it and goes, it's absolutely fine. If someone looks at it and goes, there's big problems with it, I'm also very happy with that because it's just improving it.
You must be.
Yeah,
Just to have feedback on your efforts. I must ask you a kind of an encompassing last question.
of course.
Temples in Malta, temples in Colombia, temples in the Inca Peru, northern Scotland. While there's much deliberation and argument about what they perhaps align to on the horizon,
Yeah.
I'm starting to think that perhaps more important than what these things aligned to, what they do all represent is a journey to centrality, to the center of something.
Mm,
Would you agree or disagree that it's not what was seen on the horizon, it's what's going on in the environment is perhaps equally, if not more so important, and there's a huge push on by ancient cultures to pilgrimage towards using roads, but also to venture into these chambered cairns to arrive at the center of something. What's your notions on centrality as a concept?
mm. Interesting. And I have to say, I think with Malta, you do have a good argument there. I can't speak for the cultures necessarily, but Malta definitely. I think there's a lot of studies that have shown, and I think my own research kind of suggests that these temples were obviously symbolic. They weren't just a structure that exists for whatever purpose.
Mm,
They did represent something, and I think there is a lot of similarities between the temples and these hypogea I've described before, these underground structures. If you walk into a temple and if you imagine it being roofed, which I think is probably the most likely scenario, although we don't know for certain,
yeah, yeah.
it would have felt like a cave. You're walking into a cave. And in a way, you're descending into the underground. No, you're going down there, and then you're coming out of it and returning back to land. There's a whole argument. Is it the tree of life? Is that what it's called? There's something. What's it called? Trying to find it. Can't find it quickly.
I'm quite aware of the tree of life in different cultures. So you're venturing into a symbolic underworld or emerging from a symbolic other place.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a journey. It's the idea of like venturing down and going in.
Yeah.
And it kind of, because you have these underground cave system where they have all the dead, where clearly rituals and activities and meaningful actions were being taken, right? That same was happening in the temples. Not exactly the same things, but the same ideas was happening there. So it almost feels like going underground has this connotation of mystery and mystique and magic and all this kind of elements coming together. And then leaving there, obviously, it's returning back to the world of the living. I've written like a paper before about the world of the living and the world of the dead, or the house of the living, house of the dead. These temples are kind of the in between the two, I think,
The passages.
passages. And like one of the interpretation I had come up with for the crux, if we were to, if we build on the first assumption, build on the second assumption, and we say the crux is there,
Hmm.
why would you be interested in the crux? And one of the reasons I kind of was putting forward was it could provide a guide. The crux was used for navigation. It's used for many cultures for navigation. If you're traveling towards Sicily, which is the closest neighbor, you would be using the crux to navigate. So if you're doing a journey into these temples and then you look out and you see the crux, that is your way out, your way forward.
There you go.
So although obviously highly speculative, we have no proof of this, there's nothing written about it, there's no way to prove that this is correct. But if we're working on those assumptions and we're saying that crux is the most likely candidate for this orientation, that could work well quite well in that kind of
So people are so ready to say the fixed north celestial pole
yeah.
was represented in the temples that were aligned to it. However, perhaps it's a complete reversal. Perhaps the regional temple was the center, the connection to the other ground, and what they saw was the crux was the representation in the sky of our center.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not that they were trying to build a crux on the earth, but they were using the crux because it was secondary to the importance of where we are now.
Yeah, it's almost a reminder of what's outside as well, and where you come from, if that makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can definitely see it fit within that kind of argument. Again, trying to find proof of it is going to be very tricky, but you know, archaeologists love to speculate, and I think that is a pretty valid theory, I would say. You know,
And there's also a big overriding broad stroke piece of evidence, and it's this is
yeah,
indigenous cultures, all the ones I've ever read, they emerged from the earth like the reptiles, the animals. But with the birth greatly of organized religion, the focus is put on the sky. And look what's happened to our landscapes as a result of that shift. That's another thing. Perhaps the reason you don't find the Maltese temples definitively oriented to the sky is because they're not. It's far more about centrality and here and now where we are.
I always think like the Maltese, but every society ever had to be interested in all of these things. There's no chance that people in the past didn't look up and go, "What's going on up there? What's happening?" And the same, like they didn't. If they looked into a cave, they probably, they must have gone, "What's happening in there?" They were obviously naturally interested in everything around them, like we are. We look up at, like I was doing this example the other day, but we look up at like the clouds and we start going, "Oh, look, that's in the shape of something, and that's in the shape of something," right? And that's clouds. We're not worshiping the clouds, but we're interested in them, right? And I think that's the thing. The orientation and like the alignments and all this kind of stuff kind of thing misses the point. I think it's interesting, it's possible. Some places it's entirely certain, but it's not that that's really matters. It's not like, oh, we want to predict the weather, we want to predict when we need to plant crops.
Yeah.
It's more like, how do they incorporate this into how they see the world? And I think that's the more interesting part. And that's why iconography is more important, and that's why this. thinking about how people in the past were seeing this environment around them, I think, is where we're going.
You brought up the cloud analogy. In indigenous Colombia, there's over 20 recorded words. We have cloud. They have 20 types of clouds. It's a cloud with water, a cloud that's just rained, a cloud that's going to, a
Yeah.
thundercloud.
But like, think of the Northern Lights,
Yeah,
people look at the north. People travel to see the Northern Lights. We don't orient temples towards them these days, but we definitely it's definitely part of
the backdrop.
our backdrop. Yeah, it's part of our culture, part of our societies.
Yes.
And just as it was for them, and just because the fact that it wasn't like their whole identity doesn't make it any less important.
Yeah, the focus has shifted, whereas they didn't have
Yeah.
compasses and the type of modern tools, but we too don't have answers to lots of the coding questions and artificial intelligence questions. So as they were focusing on what were the stars doing and what are the seasons and the animals doing, we've just shifted our curiosity, if you like.
Yeah, it's something that like the whole PhD is about trying to legitimize the field of 3D reconstruction because there's so much like
Mm,
in archaeology, there's so much theory and like ideas and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, that's all good. I like that. But then also, what do we actually know? Like, what is there a theory
yeah.
that's more valid than the other theories? And for me, it just comes down to data, and that's kind of why we're here. You know.
Do you think in 30 years there's going to be an app and AI will have looked at all landscapes and given you used all of your probability studies and it just tells you yes Moon, yes Venus, Antares, or no? Do you think that's ahead of us like everything else? Big data.
I mean, big data is a big thing. I know somebody called Roman McLaughlin who's working in down south in Maynooth University on creating basically chronology for the whole of Ireland or the whole of the UK, I think. And like he used the bots to go through the internet and trawl and find like every single radiocarbon date that's ever been done, basically, and he's using that to make a very big picture of it, and that's phenomenal. I mean, it is. I think that the phenomenon is like, yeah, like you could probably do something like that quite easily.
Without giving you a probability on each
I
one.
mean, in a way, like my software, like if you just tell me like here's a site, here's an orientation, I can tell you like, in a year I'll tell you what's happening that year. It does happen. But I think it is kind of missing the point again. It's like, yeah, sure, but what's the context of it,
Yeah, totally.
Like, if you give me like, the House of Parliament, maybe that's orientated to something. I'll tell you what it's orientated towards, but does it matter? No.
I've still to find a professor to talk to about. Maybe you know someone. I find 19th century architectural astronomy, cultural
Mm,
astronomy fantastic. We have a beautiful example, the Duke of Sutherland, who committed the Highland clearances in the north of Scotland.
mm,
He built a church just north of Helmsdale, a small village in the northeast of Scotland, Loth Church. And the Duke of Sutherland, as a work of cultural brutality, built, there's a statue of him 300 feet high on the highest hill overlooking the towns that he run to the coast and decimated. But I worked out and I went and saw it and I just felt part of something. I went to the church on his birthday, and just as I predicted, the sun out from the altar of the church, looking out the door, the sun sets right behind the statue of himself. It's beautiful, and I love 19th century the resurrection or the revival of
yeah,
such
it's
things.
good. I think it is interesting because again, not to sound too possessional, where you're trying to reduce human beings to just laws of nature, but
Hmm.
I think like seeing how we do stuff today is a good way to kind of look at how people would have done stuff in the past as well, or just seeing like sources that we can see today. That's why I was asking so much about your areas because
Hmm.
I think like it was genuinely curious because you have first-hand experience of people who say they are interested in these features.
Yeah.
But my point is, once they become the new Maltese culture, 5,000 years from now, what of that is going to remain? What are we going to have that is still, you know, is it going to be misinterpreted? Are you going to have a load of people going, "Oh, there's no alignments"? Are you going to have people going, it makes you really think of, if someone digs up my house, are they going to go, "Oh, it's aligned to the equinox. This man was a sun worshipper"? Who knows? Maybe they will.
2 years ago, my wife and I built a house, and we've got this beautiful mountain range in front of us, the indigenous mountain of the moon, they call it.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that our house could have been aligned perfectly to where the sun sets behind the tip of the mountain on the equinox. I got out my sticks and I got out my compass and I got out my apps, and I signed off one day. I said, "Here is the orientation of our house." Now, I killed everybody for the next 3 weeks. I trued that up and changed it 8 times. And then, just before the house was going to be built, I had my equinox temple perfect. I realized that from the right hand side of the house, the sitting room view, I could see the houses in the distance on the bottom of the hill, and I didn't like that. So I knocked it 5 degrees to the south of equinox because it suited me for a real life reason. I think that happened a lot in prehistory as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's the thing. I mean, as I said, like, I'm not trying to say the temples weren't orientated to something. It's just doesn't have to be astronomical. Could be, doesn't have to be. Could be anything.
Yeah.
And that's kind of beautiful.
There's an interesting one from the Chaco Canyon. Dr. Rich Friedman told me yesterday that we talked about these physical roads 9 meters wide. And what he explained to me is he said the compulsion is to look for astronomical alignments. He said he's convinced after the amounts of indigenous people he's spoken to that the roads represent a map of their underworld.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's a mixture of what appeared in their observable sky and what traditionally and culturally is associated with ways to move through their underworld.
Yeah. But that's it. I just, I don't like. I hate to see like all these very complex and individual cultures be kind of just misrepresented as just like
Yeah.
they love the sun. They did everything towards the sun, and it's like, nah, but did they?
Yeah.
I'm sure there was a lot more to the cultures and the way they saw things, and and
Yes.
even if it was just to put it so that the winter sun rose in front of them because they thought it was beautiful,
Yeah.
that will fit my data, and it just means that they like the look of it, and it's like, great, that sounds lovely. That's what I choose to believe.
Absolutely, because humans have always been exceptionally aesthetic.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree with that in a really deep level. It's always what looks bonniest.
Exactly.
Robert, I just can't thank you enough for this. It's been such an interesting chat.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's been very interesting for me as well. You've definitely got a very interesting perspective on it, and just your knowledge on it is very, very interesting. And
I thank you for that, but what I'm still sort of in a state of shock is that I had kind of assumed you were going to be quite complex and quite number heavy, but you've got a really good way of making these subjects palatable.
okay, I'm very glad. I think communication is key in archaeology, and I think data is essential. You need to know the numbers and you need to follow the data and stuff. But if no one can understand it, what's the point? You need to make sure people can get the bigger concepts out of it as well.
Yeah, but you're the kind of guy you could go for a pint with as well and talk about
Hey,
football. A lot of them can't.
hey, if you're ever in Belfast, let me know, and we can go.
Incidentally, I'm going to be in Dublin next April.
Okay.
So I will, without doubt, drop you a bell. I could be moving around, but I'm going to thank you a lot, and this will be out in the first weeks of February. But I'll send you a link to when the podcast launches in January because the people that are going to be on it, you'll love to hear their perspectives and all this.
Yeah, definitely. I am looking forward. I'm looking forward to hearing all the other guests. Who else have you got, by the way? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, sure. So I told you about Professor Magley.
Yeah.
I have Dr. Stephen Lexon from the University of Boulder, Colorado. He's an expert on what's known as the Chaco Meridian. I have
Mm,
Timothy Pocutat, who's an expert on the mounds of the Southwest. I have
yeah.
Dr. Edward Bernhardt, who mapped Palenque in Mesoamerica with drones. Do you know Dr. Kenny Brophy from Glasgow?
Kenny Brophy. Yeah, I think the name sounds familiar. So yeah.
Kenneth Brophy's on, Dr. Rich Friedman, and towards the end of the month, I've got a couple more Scots. I've got a Dr. Philip Tonner who's going to be talking to me about the phenomenology of archaeology, which I can't wait for.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's good. I like that.
I'm going to let you get back on with your
No,
day. And as I said, I'll send you a link when this is
nice.
ready to go. And it wouldn't be unusual if sometime after Christmas you get an email from me saying, look, can we do something else and on a specific subject? And I've got a funny feeling it'll be to do with your coding.
Cool.
I think there's somebody I'd love you to meet. The guy Rich Friedman, and you go Google him and watch his YouTubes. It's wild. He uses drones with different types of lidar to 3D print ancient buildings and structures and whatnot.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, because it allows true interaction, and I just think there's something that could be happening on the offing with technology and archaeology. I'm definitely going to mention you as a digital archaeologist. I thought that was a
Yeah,
lovely
I think
line.
so. It's something that not a lot of people call themselves these days, but I think, you know,
Yeah,
yeah, it's definitely true. If I never worked on Malta again, that's fine. As long as I do coding, I'm happy.
your hands will be bony when you're 60. You won't have broken nails.
Oh God, yeah. If I don't have a heart attack before the code doesn't work. Anyway,
Oh, go away. Great stuff, then. Thanks again, Robert. It was lovely to meet you.
no worries. Thank you very much. Let me know let me know what the date is for the release because I'll get like the university to publish it. And
Oh, thank you. It'll be the first week of January, but I'll send that to you before it.
excellent. Thank you very much. I'll chat with you soon.
Lovely to meet you. Cheers, Robert.
Lovely to meet you too. Yeah. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, drop a 5-star review, or share it with a friend. And you can get in touch with me through historyfuzz.com.